Hi everyone, this is the online lecture for government budget and fiscal policy. Now we're now gradually coming to the end of the ADAS model, where based on that you evaluate government action and think about solutions to problems from the perspective of the government. And this is something that you should do also for the project when you're evaluating the country of your choice. Okay, to look at how the government is dealing with certain problems and to offer some recommendations. Now, the government functions like a household, a very big household, where there's revenue coming in and then expenditure being spent on various things. So we're going to take a look at that. Now, unlike a person or a regular household, government has to be accountable for how it spends and how much it spends. So it usually plans a year ahead. So they would usually decide on have some forecast like how much is the revenue coming in and what are the expenditure that they are prepared to spend in the coming year, and then there'll be a budget status. Okay, there'll be a budget status as you see here. Okay, so all this budget status is planned. Unlike most of us that sometimes we just have a rough idea, government spending is tightly controlled by the constitution. Okay, so they have to be accountable and answerable to the people, and therefore they usually plan ahead and they are very systematic in saying what are they going to spend, how much are they going to tax. All right. Now you have some possible budget status. If the government revenue is more than expenditure, of course you have surplus. Okay, that means amount remaining. This surplus goes into what we call the reserves of a country. Reserve of a country is like a savings of a country. Those extra amounts are set aside for rainy day or for other purposes. Okay. Now the government could be overspending. In this case, expenditure is larger than the revenue. In this case, the government is suffering from a budget deficit, overspending. Now, you have to settle this deficit. Many people have the misconception that, oh, if there's a deficit, then let's spend less next year. But that's for next year. What happens to the deficit that you are incurring for this year? You have to find a way of financing it. Okay, we'll talk about that a bit later. But let's take a look at some countries and their budgets. Okay. In the lecture, we went through a couple of countries like US and Japan. Let's take a look at Singapore in this online lecture. Now, this is the Singapore accounts where you have 2015 numbers and the estimated 2016 numbers. Okay, let's take a look at your operating revenue. How much that government is taking in is here. All right, and how much the government is spending, okay, is here. All right. You can see that in 2016, both operating revenue and expenditure are expected to go up. Okay, you have special transfers. These are endowments and top-ups. Okay, to your CPF accounts and other accounts, and your overall budget status is here. So for 2015, we had a deficit of 4.88 billion Sing dollars, and for 2016, we expected to have a 3.45 billion surplus. All right, so this is an example of a budget position of Singapore. Now, going back to the story on the deficit. So when you overspend, okay, like in 2015 we overspend, how are you going to finance the deficit? Let's take a look at the options. Now, when you're financing a budget deficit, you can either finance from reserves. Remember we mentioned that any excess amounts that you set aside goes to your reserves. So when you overspend, you can take out from a reserve to finance whatever that's not enough for this year. Or if your reserves doesn't have adequate funds, you are forced to borrow from financial markets, from other countries, or from IMF and World Bank. Okay, now what's the difference between financing from reserve and borrowing? Now, when you finance from reserve, this is your own money. You can do whatever you want. You have less restrictions. Of course, most countries have guiding principles how to use your reserves. In Singapore, the reserves can only be used if the government requests and the president say yes. So there's some kind of control in all countries. Okay, but it's your own money, and when you spend, you don't have to pay yourself interest. But borrowing, you usually have to pay interest. So that becomes a problem. All right. Now let's take a look at this item here: borrowing from financial markets. What is it? Now, when you borrow from financial markets, one common way is to issue bonds. Okay, the government will issue bonds. Almost all countries do it. Singapore also do it. Okay, now what's a bond? Now, bond is like an IOU. You sell a bond for, let's say, a certain amount of face value to investors. Investor buy your bonds and you pay them interest when the bonds mature. So for example, if Singapore sell, let's say, a 10-year bond, each one $1,000 with a 3% interest. So at the end of the 10-year, you redeem the bond from the government will pay you back the $1,000 plus 3% interest. Okay? Now, of course, you have to pay interest, otherwise people wouldn't buy your bonds. All right? So a country always have to offer interest rate, an interest payment to bond buyers. Okay, and if people don't want to buy a bond, you are forced to offer higher and higher interest rate to attract buyers, okay, to buy your bonds. So issuing bonds is one way that you borrow money from the mass market. Anybody can buy bonds. The people, foreigners, investors. Okay, so when they buy bonds, it's a way of lending the government money. Okay, and the government has to repay the bonds when they mature plus interest. Okay, so bonds incur interest. Now this interesting detail on the cost of interest on US debt. So this is how much the US is paying and projected to pay in terms of servicing their debt. Okay, you can see the information in your course notes on the debt that the US is currently owing. Okay, and you can see this only interest payment and not on the repayment of debt. Okay, interest payment only. I can see that it's projected to go up and in huge amounts. I put in a comparison here. Singapore Changi Airport Terminal 3 costs 1.75 billion to build, and how much they're paying in terms of interest. Okay. Now, more on the US government. Whom does the US government owe money? You can see they usually borrow from their own financial markets. Okay, they also owe money to other countries like China and Japan. Okay, and other foreign nations. So the US borrow widely. Okay, but the main bulk of it comes from their own people. Okay. Now, there is an opportunity cost to borrowing money. Okay, because in the next year and the years later, you have to pay higher and higher interest payments to service your debt. Okay, so if you owe a lot of money and you have to pay a lot of interest payments in the budget, you cannot have so much money to do the things that are important, like building infrastructure, like building your country or for your social payments. Right? You can't do a lot of what you want to do because you have to set aside some money to pay your interest payments when you borrow too much. Okay, so borrowing money has an opportunity cost to your budget position. Okay, you eat into your budget and you can't do as much as you want for your own country. All right. So a country that cannot reduce spending must borrow more to service its borrowing. Now, we mentioned in lecture that the US is a very interesting case. That's why we're talking about it in lecture. It's like a very rich man in debt. The US is the largest economy in the world, but it's in a lot of debt as well. Okay, so a country that cannot reduce its spending, is spending too much on all kinds of things, then you must borrow more to service how much you want to spend. So it becomes like a vicious cycle. All right, look at how your country, your project country, is doing. Are they owing a lot of money? What are they spending on? And how much are they taking in? And how are they taking it? Then you can have some understanding and some conclusions about how the country of your choice is operating. We can be very interesting. All right. Now, where does the government take in money? Of course, you have taxes and then fees, fines, income from government investment. For Singapore, we invest on our reserves, and there's some returns that come from there. So it enters the budget as a form of income, okay, and leasing out or renting out of state-owned land. So these are the sources of government revenue. You can read more about it in your notes. Okay. Now, some background on taxes. Taxes are what you pay the government. All right. Now, government to function, they must tax. Otherwise, the government is not a business entity. It doesn't derive income on its own. Okay, they must tax. Now, so the government tax on various activities. Okay, like your salary. Okay, so this is called income tax. All right, when they tax you on your income, or a corporate tax on businesses' income. Okay, so this is called income tax in general. Goods and services tax is taxing on when we buy things. Okay, now this is called a consumption tax in other countries, or ad valorem tax in other countries. Okay, you pay the tax when you spend. When you don't spend, you don't pay the tax. Okay, and also other taxes like property tax and some others. Okay, now this is the you can see this in your notes. This is the overall sources of the government revenue. Okay, you can see that for Singapore, this is for Singapore. So the government derive big chunks of their income from corporate taxes, GST, and also personal income tax, and some other smaller taxes. Okay, but the big chunks come from corporate taxes, personal taxes, and GST, which is quite similar to most countries. Okay. Now, on personal income tax, now there's a couple of ways that the government can impose income tax, and one of the ways that the government can tax you on your income is called progressive tax system. Now, what is it? It means that people who earn more pay a higher income tax rate. Okay, people who earn more pays a higher income tax rate. Now, how does it look like? Let's take a look. Now, this is a progressive tax system of Singapore. Okay, now if you observe, people who earn less, of course, first $20,000 that you earn, you pay no tax. Now the rate becomes higher and higher and higher as you earn more and more money. Okay, the whole system tops off at about 320,000, where you pay 20% tax rate. Okay, now you can see that the rate goes higher and higher for every level of higher income that you earn. Okay, from 0 to 2 and then 3.57%. Okay, so on and so forth. This is called a progressive tax system. Okay, now what is the usage of progressive tax system? Later you will see that you have some kind of positive effect in terms of stabilizing the economy, and socially speaking, is also a fairer way. You have wealthier people paying a higher share of the tax rate. How does the tax rate of your country, project country, looks like? Okay, you can compare with Singapore and have some conclusion whether your country's income tax rate is higher or lower than Singapore, and you can come up with some interesting conclusions. Now, the GST is a consumption tax, and we mentioned you pay only when you buy things. Okay. Now, this is a broad-based tax. Okay. Now, a government can decide to tax people on their income or tax people on their spending, and of course on both. Now, why do you have two different kinds of taxes? Now, because you are taxing people on various aspects, various activities, that economic activities that's being carried out. One is of course earning money, you have income. The other is on buying things. Now, consumption tax like GST is very useful and important because it's broad-based. That means even those people who are not working are taxed. So as long as you spend money, you are taxed. So from 3 years old when you buy things until you reach 90 years old when you're buying things, you're still paying taxes whenever you buy things. Okay, so it's much more broad-based than income tax, where you pay only when you earn income. Okay, now this is useful especially with aging population, which means that you have less people working, which means that you have less people paying income tax. Now, if you only tax people on income, when you're aging population, your tax revenue will start to go down. Then you have some problems. Okay, but when you have GST, more people will be able to contribute to government revenue. All right, so this is the one of the reason why GST was imposed in Singapore, and the current GST is 7%, and I think it will go up further as Singapore becomes our population becomes older in the future. Now the government derive its revenue also from leasing out land. Okay, HDB for example is leasing out land. It's 99 year. Okay, government owns most of the land in the country, so they rent it out um, as a form of revenue. Now the government also need to spend money to develop the economy, to operate the country. Okay, and these are some of the examples that you need to spend on. You need to buy things, you need to purchase goods and services, spend on national defense, education, national development, healthcare, etc., etc. Okay, so the government, other than taking funds, you also need to spend. Okay, the government also make transfer payments to individual to top up your accounts, welfare benefit, like EduSave account, Medifund, CPF, so on and so forth. Okay, these are transfer payments. Now, we mentioned in the GDP chapter that transfer payments does not generate GDP per se. Okay, now because the government is transferring money to you, to your account, if you don't spend it, nothing is generated. Okay, but it still costs the government money to do that, to transfer money into your account, but it doesn't generate any form of national income until you spend it. Okay, so learn how to tell the difference. Because it doesn't generate GDP doesn't mean that it doesn't cost money to make the payment. It does. Okay. If the government is owing a lot of money, you have to set aside money, as we mentioned earlier, for debt interest payments. This is a rough breakdown of how the Singapore government spend money. Okay, and this is also inside your notes. So the large chunk of it is spent on social development, and then the other chunks are economic development, and then security and external relationship. Okay, so you can take a look in your notes. You can choose from some budget positions like a budget surplus, budget deficit, or a relatively balanced budget where they spend about as much as they have. Okay, now just a few considerations. If you're running a budget deficit, where to find the money? Okay, to finance it, to finance the deficit. So why or when does the government wants to have a budget surplus or deficit? Remember we said earlier that a government usually plans its budget ahead of time, ahead of the year. So when does it plan for a budget surplus or deficit? We'll take a look during fiscal policy proper. Okay, let's move on. Now, fiscal policy is a form of government response to resolving problems in the economy or guiding the economy to long-term growth and development by changing the amount that it is spending and the taxes that it's collecting, okay, in order to achieve its macroeconomic goals. So fiscal policy is one of the main response that the government can use, and it revolves around changing the amount that it's spending, or the taxes or taxes that it's charging. Now, studying macroeconomics till now, you should know that in econs, we always say that there's two major problems that we're always dealing with, and there's recession or unemployment, and the next one is price rising, which is inflation. So we want to know how does the government resolve or face these problems with fiscal policy. Let's go in detail to look at what fiscal policy is all about. Now, fiscal policy is a demand management policy. Now, when we study ADS, we went through this question: which curve does the government directly control? And there's AD through change in G. Okay, and now you know that there's also a change in T. Now, AD is aggregate demand in the economy. So, fiscal policy, when you change G and change AD, it is a demand management policy. You try to tweak the demand of the economy to achieve certain goals, such as full employment and price stability. Okay, so later you see the diagram that we are largely shifting AD only. All right. Now there's two forms of fiscal policy. The first one that we'll look at is called discretionary fiscal policy. Now, discretionary means that the government take deliberate action. That means do something out of the blue, do something exceptional. Okay, take special steps to change the amount that it is spending and the tax amount that is collecting to change AD as to resolve certain problems or to achieve certain goals. Okay, this action is deliberate, is exceptional. Okay, so we call this discretionary. Discretionary means you do it uh, out of usual kind of operational sequence. Okay, it's an exceptional step. That's why we call it deliberate action. It's meant to resolve serious problems. Again, fiscal policy involves changing G and changing T, especially discretionary. Discretionary, we change the amount of expenditure and change the amount of taxes that's collecting. All right. Now, we mentioned earlier that we have two problems. One is recession or unemployment. One is inflation. Let's take a look at the first one. Now, the first one, we imagine that there is a recession. Okay, so on the diagram later, you see that we start off from a recessionary gap. Okay, now you can visualize the diagram. You can see that we will be starting from a below full employment output. Okay, now the government will use expansionary fiscal policy. Now please remember the kind of names that we use. This is the goal. Expansionary in terms of what? In terms of output. That means the government is trying to expand output to close the recessionary gap. Okay, so for a recession, expansionary policy is usually the way to deal with it. Okay, because a recession means that the output is too low, you have a recessionary gap. So expansionary policy helps to make up for the gap, okay, to recover the gap. All right. How does expansionary fiscal policy works? Now, when government increase expenditure, all right, in the recession, AD goes up. This one you guys should know, because AD consists of CIGXM. The second part is additional that we are covering in this topic. There's a decrease in income tax at the same time the government is spending more. Tax will fall, okay? And when tax falls, people have higher disposable income. Now, what's disposable income? Is your salary less the taxes that you pay. That means your net salary, your net income after paying for taxes. So you have more money out of your pocket, right? Your disposable income rises because you're taxed less. So as a result, you tend to spend more and AD will rise. Okay. Now on the diagram, because AD registers CIGXM, there's no where for tax. Usually we say G rises. Okay. G rises and T falls. Okay. But the effect is that consumption also rises because people are taxed less. Okay. So this brings about AD rising and AD curve shift to the right. Let's take a look at the diagram. This is very simple. Originally, you were at AD, cuts SRS, you were at equilibrium A, okay? And you are producing below full employment output. So you see there's a recessionary gap. Okay, that means the economy is in recession. So after G goes up, AD shift to the right, and you're back at full employment output, your new equilibrium is at point B. Okay, now so diagram is actually very straightforward. You start from below full employment output, up G down T, AD rises, and you're back at full employment output. Okay, so the diagram is pretty straightforward. Now, as a result of your AD shifting to the right, just now you could see in the diagram, price goes up, real GDP goes up, and the gap no more. Okay, assuming that everything goes as planned, your recession is successfully overcome because government spend more money, so AD shift to the right, so you have no more recessionary gap. Now, let's take a look at another problem. So other than recession or unemployment problem, we have an inflation problem. So this is a time where prices are rising. Okay, now when the economy get heated up, that means there's a overbuying, over investment, prices are rising. Government use contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, contractionary, try to reduce output. Okay, now contractionary fiscal policy is meant to resolve inflation. After seeing the diagram earlier, you will be able to imagine how a contractionary fiscal policy looks like. But let's take a look at what is it. So contractionary fiscal policy means there's a decrease in government expenditure. Okay, government cuts back in expenditure, so AD falls. Okay, because G is falling, AD falls. At the same time, the government will increase taxes. Now, when government tax you more, the net income that you have after paying for taxes, your disposable income will fall because you're paying more taxes. So your net income falls. So when you have less money out of your pocket, your consumption will tend to fall, and because of that, AD will fall. Okay, so AD shift to the left. Let's take a look at the diagram. So originally, we start off with an above full employment output. Okay, to symbolize that the economy is overproducing. Okay, so we are above full employment output. So prices are too high. As a result, the government cut back on expenditure, increase taxes. So when people have less income, they spend less. So altogether, AD shift to the left from AD to AD1. So from equilibrium point A, all right, the equilibrium point is now at B. So you're back at full employment output, and you reduce the inflationary gap back to full employment output. Okay, so this is how you resolve an inflation problem with contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, you're contracting output from Y to YF. So after shifting the curve, you will notice that price level falls. Okay, as a result, real GDP falls, and no more inflationary gap. Okay. Now, does fiscal policy sounds too good to be true in resolving our problems of recession and inflation? On paper, it works very well, and in real life, it does work very well. But there's some limitations to how discretionary fiscal policy can help us resolve problems. The main problem in using discretionary fiscal policy is in terms of time lags. Okay, time lags in formulating and implementing discretionary policy. Now, there's three types of time lags. That means there's some kind of delay in using the policy that's caused by problems in mostly governing. All right, let's take a look at what they are. Now, recognition lag. Currently, the global practice is you can only declare a recession when your GDP growth goes down in 2 consecutive quarters. Okay, that means that if a recession started in January, the fastest you can call it a recession is after June, and it takes time to collect data. Okay, so recognition lag involves the delay in declaring that there's a problem because you need time to ascertain the data. Okay, now lawmaking lag. Now just now I mentioned that when you set up a government budget, if you're the government, you set up a government budget, you need parliament approval, and the political process differs from country to country, but government cannot change your spending and tax rate just like that. You have to go to parliament, argue it out. In US, they go to Congress, and you need a majority of people to agree with you before you can commit to the changes. So there's another delay there in terms of lawmaking. Okay, now impact lag is when you already decided what to do. Let's say you want to cut income taxes, but the income tax collection period may have already passed for the year. Then you got to wait until next year. So there's a delay in effect. Or there's a recession. You think you want to build a new MRT line to try to counter the recession, okay, to increase aggregate demand. But to build MRT line, you need to do a lot of work before that. You need to get a tender. You need to get architects to look at where the line should go. By the time that you are done, probably the recession may have passed, and another situation may have replaced the problem. So when you're activating a policy, the delay could come at a time when it's no longer needed. And when that happens, it could backfire. For example, if there's a recession and you employ an expansionary fiscal policy, then there's a delay because of any of this lag, and there's a delay. And by the time the effect comes on, the economy could be suffering from inflation due to an increase in exports, for example. The problem could have changed, and your solution comes at the wrong time because it's so delayed, and then the effect will be quite bad, okay, because it will backfire. All right, so this is the limitation of fiscal policy, largely due to the time lag. Now, so in conclusion, uh, to solve a recession, you use an expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, to solve inflation, you use contractionary fiscal policy. Now, the term expansionary and contractionary is common to describe policy direction. So in macroecons, you will learn two policies. One is fiscal, one is monetary. When we reach monetary policy, the direction is still the same, expansionary or contractionary. All right, and the way that is applied to the problem is also the same. Whenever there's a recession, we use an expansionary policy. Whenever there's inflation, we use a contractionary policy. Okay, you may want to think about what happened in a stagflation between. That means there's uh, the problem comes in twofold: recession plus inflation. So what policy do you use, and what impact would that be? You can play around with the diagrams and then see what happens when you use fiscal policy to resolve stagflation. What happens, right? Work it out on your own. Now, next part we're going to look at is automatic stabilizers. Okay. Now, other than discretionary policy just now we mentioned means that you do something out of the blue. Now, on a day-to-day basis, there are actually systems in place to stabilize the economy such that small changes, okay, will be evened out on a day-to-day basis. All right. Now, the stabilizers are in place in the form of a system. The government doesn't need to do anything. It's without explicit action by the government. So the government doesn't need to do anything, but the system is in the background, okay, stabilizing usual day-to-day operations. So small problems can be resolved by automatic stabilizer. Okay. Now this is a background system that's in place. When the major problem occurs, your automatic stabilizers will not work anymore. That's where you got to use discretionary. Out of the blue, change G, change T. Okay. But on a day-to-day basis, there's automatic stabilizers to help stabilize the economy. Let's see how it works. Now, two components in automatic stabilizers allow it to stabilize small changes in the economy. The first one is a progressive tax system. We've gone through that earlier. Progressive tax system means that higher income people get taxed more in terms of percentage. Okay. And other than tax system, there's a welfare benefit system. These two are in the background all the time. So together, they stabilize the economy whenever there's small fluctuations. All right. We've gone through earlier what is progressive tax system. People with higher income, the rate that they are taxed becomes higher and higher. Let's see how it works out as part of automatic stabilizers. Now, when there's a recession, okay, people of course become poorer as real GDP falls. Okay. Now, when your income falls, your income bracket, you saw earlier, there's a lot of income brackets, higher, lower, you know. When your income falls, you pay lower tax rate, as you saw earlier. All right. And during a recession, government usually give you more welfare benefits. Now, together, it will cushion the fall in your income so that you don't become poor too quickly. All right. So an automatic stabilizer prevents you from crashing so hard to the ground when there's a recession or when there's a fluctuation downwards. Okay. So during a bad time, you pay lower taxes because of the progressive tax system, and you collect more benefits. Now take note, you pay lower tax rate is not because the government changed the tax rate. This is not discretionary. This is not out of the blue. The system is such that when your income falls, the tax rate will fall. Okay, so this is a system. So the government didn't change anything. So based on the system, because your income has fallen, you pay lower tax rate as you saw in the chart earlier. Okay, so at the same time you collect more welfare benefits, your income fall lesser. Okay, so it slows down the fall in your income level. Okay. Now, during a booming time whereby income is rising, okay, because GDP is rising, people will qualify to pay more taxes. Okay, you saw in the chart when income goes up, your tax rate goes higher because of progressive tax system. Okay, so income goes up, your tax rate goes up. At the same time, because your income is higher, the government gives you less welfare benefits. So together, it helps to slow down the increase in your income. Okay, now someone may be wondering, what is so bad about people becoming rich or income goes up very fast? Now, when it goes up too fast, people will tend to overspend and the economy will become overheated. Okay, and prices will tend to rise very fast. So to prevent that from happening, the government will try to slow down the rise in your income by giving you less benefits, and you will automatically pay more tax because of the progressive tax system. Okay, a booming time is also a good time for the government to collect more taxes to keep for a rainy day. Okay, so all in all, your real GDP and income goes up slower, okay, by a lesser extent. Okay, a diagram for automatic stabilizers is different from your ADAS. Huh? This is how it works. Now, before automatic stabilizer, GDP can go up and down in a very volatile way. Okay, can fluctuate a lot. All right. And after automatic stabilizers are in place, your progressive tax system and your welfare benefits, the change is more gradual. Okay, the upside is moderated, the downside is also more gradual. Okay, the idea is to stabilize the economy and to prevent wide and wild swings in GDP movements. Now, why is fluctuations not a good thing? Because when your GDP change too fast over a short period of time, especially businesses will not have the confidence. They won't know what's going to happen. All right, and when that's the case, they may not invest in your country because they won't know what's going to happen because your GDP is changing so drastically. All right, up and down. So automatic stabilizers are important because it slows down changes and stabilize the entire economy. Okay, so this diagram is a bit different from ADAS. Okay, so just remember it if you're asked. Now, this coming week is your off-campus learning week. Try the tutorial first, then take a look at the fiscal policy tutorial video on the OCL tab in the LMS. Okay, see you soon.